Thank you so much for the introduction. Thank you everyone for being here. I'm really excited. So welcome to my PhD defense on this Monday morning. As already introduced by Alex, in the next 30 minutes I will give you a short introduction to my thesis with the title Computational Approaches to Human Behavior from Emotion Regulation to Hate Speech. Before I actually dive into the content, I want to briefly recap parts of my academic journey. First, yes, I'm already getting nostalgic, but at the same time, I think my work is easier understood if you consider my background. So it was back in 2018 when I wrote my first lines of code. This was in an introductory Python course at Graz, still in my psychology master's. It was very basic, to be fair, but it gave me the confidence to pursue a non-degree certificate in computer science at TU Graz, which is called Route 63. And now, 5 years later, I am here with a thesis in computational social science. When first hovering between psychology and computer science, I learned two things. And the first thing is, computer science will quantify anything. And I really appreciate it. I think it's really impressive, especially text data, which in psychology we traditionally refer to as qualitative or non-quantifiable. So this taught me that, not every scientific problem needs a Likert scale and a linear regression, but that methods can be diverse and provide different angles to the same question. And the second thing I learned is computer science will quantify anything. Meaning that, yes, you can measure something, but it does not necessarily mean that your measure is meaningful. And I experienced that my background in psychometrics and, psychological theory can actually be helpful in improving computational methods, especially for social sciences. That's why in my thesis, I develop and use computational methods to increase the rigor of research on human behavior. And I will showcase this mission with two exemplary works from my thesis today. One is from the field of emotion regulation, and one is from the field of hate and counterspeech. And the emotion regulation project is more on the side of methods development, and the hate and counterspeech project is more on the side of the field-specific contributions. But in the following, I want to highlight both methodological aspects as well as field-specific aspects for both of the projects. In the following, I will give you a short introduction into what to expect in the remainder of this presentation. In the first project, I will introduce a new method to reveal psychological constructs from text data. A psychological construct is something like personality or intelligence or emotion regulation, like a latent concept. Then I will use this method to infer a data-driven classification of emotion regulation strategies. And emotion regulation, very simply put, is how we deal with our emotions in everyday life. Then in the second project, I will highlight the benefits of mixed methods approaches when measuring psychological concepts in large-scale text. Specifically, we use theory building methods from the social sciences to conceptualize counterspeech, and then natural language processing to scale the analysis up to a large data set of Twitter conversations. And with that, this brings me to my last point. I show what counterspeech strategies can actually be effective against online hate because we analyze the relationship between counterspeech and hate speech in exactly those Twitter conversations. To guide you through the presentation in the following, I will use those four symbols. The first symbol indicates methodological questions. The second symbol indicates answers thereto. Then I have a symbol for field-specific questions from the fields of emotion regulation and counterspeech, and field-specific answers there too. Right. So let me start with the first work, a computational method to reveal psychological constructs from text data. This was published in Psychological Methods in 2024, which is one of the top psychological journals at that time. As I said before, this method was inspired by an application case in emotion regulation. And emotion regulation is the way we influence which emotions we have, when we have them, and how we experience and express these emotions. So, for example, we can downregulate negative emotions, probably the first thing that everyone thinks of, but we can also upregulate positive emotions, we can regulate ourselves, we can regulate others. And how we do that actually influences our social functioning as well as our psychological health. Let's look together at the emotion regulation questionnaire, which is one of the most popular questionnaires to assess emotion regulation to date. And it says, very typically, on a scale from 1 to 7, please rate. For example, when I want to feel more positive emotion, I change what I'm thinking about. And this questionnaire was designed to assess 2 specific emotion regulation strategies, reappraisal and suppression. Reappraisal is positively rethinking negative situations, and suppression is suppressing one's emotions or the expression thereof. And to be clear, there's nothing wrong with this questionnaire. It's great to assess those 2 strategies. It's validated, it's tested. However, I'm asking the question, what about potential other subcomponents of emotion regulation, like distraction or social support? Emotion researchers hypothesize that emotion regulation is adaptive when people adjust their strategies to the situations they are experiencing, which is called emotion regulation flexibility. Now, if we only look at a subset of strategies, then we might not capture the full variability of emotion regulation and therefore not be able to determine whether something like emotion regulation flexibility is actually beneficial or to what extent. On the methodological side of things, like reappraisal and suppression are operationalized in a certain way. But there might be other phrasings that are better to assess the constructs of interest, the components of interest. So the choice of components assessed as well as how they are assessed is subject to researchers' choices. But I want to make sure that what we assess is actually most practically relevant. So to sum up, once we have defined the construct through theory, we know very well what to do. We will create a questionnaire when we formulate items and then test it with factor analysis and validate it further with correlational studies. But we very rarely think about what comes before that. How do we arrive at those components to define the construct of interest? That's why we introduced the construct mining pipeline, which is a method that uses both social science techniques as well as techniques from machine learning to create data-driven yet standardized definitions of psychological constructs. And I'm displaying the whole pipeline for your overview here, but to be respectful of time, in the following I will merely highlight I will merely discuss the highlights of the method, and I will do so on the example of emotion regulation, where we infer a data-driven taxonomy of emotion regulation strategies. So the first thing we did is we collected emotion regulation strategies with a set of 9 open-ended questions. And one of those questions is displayed here as an example. You find out that some members of your social sports team have been saying that you are not a very good player, and then participants were supposed to list all ideas that they can think of to change their feelings for the better in the short or the long run. And they came up with suggestions like, I seek help with a trainer, I confront the team members, and so on and so forth. So now we have a set of description of emotion regulation strategies, and we can use them to embed them in a semantic space using a state-of-the-art sentence transformer model. We also take the question texts, run them through the same embedding model, and put them together in the semantic space with the emotion regulation descriptions. This enables us to quantify the influence of the data collection process on this embedding space. by measuring what we call item bias with a newly developed indicator. Let's look at this. So you can see that emotion regulation descriptions that are generated with respect to a specific question are actually closer in that embedding space to that question than to all other questions. And this is a concern because eventually we want to cluster on that embedding space, and the clusters might not form based on emotion regulation classes, but more on keywords of those situations that are described in the questions. So to prevent this, we try to remove the item bias by masking keywords from the situational descriptions in the emotion regulation strategies. Right, so we are effectively debiasing the embedding space. Notice how now the emotion regulation descriptions are more evenly distributed between the questions in that embedding space. This is great. Now we can proceed to the heart of this pipeline, which is clustering on that space to identify candidate classes of emotion regulation strategies. We used UMAP and HDB scan to perform this clustering. And we also did hyperparameter tuning for UMAP and HDB scan in conjunction to satisfy a range of different criteria. And feel free to ask me about that in detail in the Q&A. Now we have the clusters as potential regulation classes, and we want to interpret them. But this interpretation can be subject to researchers' perceptions and confirmation bias. So we want to establish yet another layer of validation. And we do so by conducting the intrusion task, where we ask another sample a range of the following questions. Which of the following sentences does not belong to the others? And then we have 3 descriptions from the same cluster and 1 description from another cluster, and people are supposed to identify the intruder. So the rationale is that if people are able to identify the intruder for a cluster on average, then this cluster is semantically coherent, meaningful, and safe to interpret. So in other words, with this intrusion task, we make sure that the classes that we find are not only making sense to the algorithm, but also to humans. And finally, the good part, we can discard the clusters with low intrusion scores and interpret the remaining ones. And here's what we find. First, we find well-known classes of emotion regulation strategies. Here are our friends reappraisal and suppression, among others. This is reassuring. Then we find classes that are known but not sufficiently discussed, at least not in the emotion regulation literature. For example, situation modification at the very top is discussed in the self-regulation literature as a broader concept, but not so much connected to emotion regulation. Third, and maybe most interesting, we also find classes that have not been discovered until today. One of them is information seeking. For example, in the situation where people are supposed to imagine that their relative is sick in the hospital, they propose to ask the doctor about the relative's prognosis. Then another one is self-enhancement. And I illustrated again with the situation. People were supposed to imagine that after years in an industry job, they are going back to the university, and it's a form of pep talk where they tell themselves and recall all the good experiences they made during the industry jobs. Finally, there are classes that are known as emotion regulation strategies, but not discussed or not discovered in our pipeline. For example, rumination and self-harm. Those are mostly detrimental strategies, and this can have several reasons. One reason is that we have a restricted sample of students, so maybe it's just not broad enough. It could also be that the vignettes or open-ended questions that we chose at the beginning did not trigger the people to suggest those strategies. But also we could hypothesize that those are actually not emotion regulation strategies, but just symptoms of emotion regulation deficiencies in a way. We love this method because we circumvent rating scales with people interpreting the construct of interest directly. We reduce researchers' degrees of freedom with a computer-assisted approach, and our findings are replicable, extensible, and scalable. But of course, it has also limitations. There are still considerable degrees of freedom, especially in the data collection and hyperparameter tuning, for example. Then the method works well for some constructs, but not others. Imagine biological psychology with constructs like attention might work not so well. The method works well for identifying classes, but not assigning them. And the method needs to be tested further. For example, we chose a specific sentence embedding model, but what if we choose others? Like, how does it affect the downstream tasks? Let's move on to the second project I want to discuss today with the title Collective Moderation of Hate, Toxicity, and Extremity in Online Discussions. And the revision of this paper is currently under review in PNAS Nexus. Collective moderation in the context of social media platforms can be understood as a bottom-up, citizen-generated response to uncivil behavior. And it is opposed to top-down moderation, like through platform regulations. And as you probably know, at least if you're on social media can be a very hateful place, as illustrated by this real example from our data set. And it's often targeted towards societal minorities or public figures. It includes insults, discrimination, or intimidation of those persons based on characteristics like their ethnicity or political orientation. And it can have severe consequences. In the best case, moderate users just leave the discussion, but in the worst case, we can hate speech can actually trigger real-world violence. A potential remedy for hate speech is counter speech, again illustrated with an example from our data set. Counter speech as a form of collective moderation has mainly been studied in qualitative studies and in experimental design so far. And in those studies, especially the qualitative ones, they identify a set of potential counter speech strategies, but we cannot determine how effective they are against hate. In the experimental designs, on the other hand, they mainly focus on selected strategies like empathy, and we then know that it's actually able to decrease hate speech, but we don't know how prevalent empathy is in the wild and whether it actually contributes something at scale. This is why we decided to pursue a large-scale observational study of the effects of counter speech on hate speech in online discussions. We therefore analyzed a large data set of German Twitter conversations, and this data set spans 4 years, from 2015 to 2018, with roughly 130,000 discussions and users and over 1 million tweets. And each of those discussions unfolds under an original post of a either major German major German news outlet or a politician or a journalist. And importantly, at that time, 2 organized groups were active. Reconquista Germanica, which is a dedicated hate speech group, and Reconquista Internet, which is a dedicated counter speech group. So we were actually able to measure our constructs of interest in that data set. We needed to quantify them, right? So we chose several different variables to operationalize counter speech and hate speech. For one, we did so because we were interested in different aspects of counter speech, but also we wanted to see whether our analysis converged over different outcome measures. So for counter speech, we measured argumentation strategy, group rhetoric, and emotions. And for hate speech, we measured hate speech, toxicity, and extremity of speech and speakers. We intended to measure those variables with machine learning classifiers in the text, and for some of them we were actually lucky and good classifiers already existed. For example, for toxicity we used Jigsaw's perspective API, right. But then for other variables, like group rhetoric, they haven't been studied in the context of counterspeech so far, so we weren't able to fall back on anything that existed. And for other variables, we were not satisfied with what was out there. So for argumentation strategy, group rhetoric, and hate speech, we trained our own machine learning classifiers. And we did so based on extensive qualitative analysis of our data. We created, annotation schemes, annotated a large training data set, and then trained Twitter XLM Roberta base models for each of those 3 variables. This came with a set of methodological challenges that I want to briefly discuss now. First, our training data was severely imbalanced. For example, in panel A of this figure on the right, you can see that some argumentation strategies like constructive comments and leaving factual discussions are very minor or not very prevalent in our data set. So what we did is we followed a strategy that is called iterative labeling, and it goes like follows. We had a first batch of human annotated data, and we used this annotated data to train a support vector machine as a preliminary classifier. Ran this classifier over the rest of the data set to be able to identify or distinguish minority from majority classes, and then draw only data to annotate further that was classified as a minority class. And then we had new training data, could improve the preliminary classifier, and so we progressed in circles, annotating batch by batch. And as you can see in panel B of this figure on the right, we were actually able to increase the minority classes as well as decrease classes that are irrelevant for our task, like other. The next methodological challenge was that when using all of our 15,000 annotated samples, our classifiers actually didn't perform as well. So we switched training strategies to something that we call training on confident examples. Let me again explain the strategy to you. So in our training data, we had tweets that had either 2 human labels or only 1 human label. And to identify confident examples in a first round, we only took tweets with 2 human labels and saw where the humans agreed. Used this to train the Roberta model, ran this Roberta model over the rest of the training data. In round 2, checked where humans and this first classifier agreed, had another set of confident examples, were able to train the Roberta for another round, and did the same in round 3 of what we call training on confident examples. And this strategy actually really neatly shows that less training data of better quality can sometimes actually be beneficial over a lot of training data of lesser quality. And in the end, we were able to achieve F1 scores between 0.6 and 0.8 for most of the classes. Yes. Now to the fun part. We were able to, quantify counter speech and hate speech with those classifiers in our data and analyze the relationship between counter and hate on 3 levels of aggregation. On the micro level, we looked at individual reply pairs. On the meso level, we looked at entire discussions. And on the macro level, we looked at the development over days. And we did so using autoregressive distributed lag modeling, a form of time series analysis, and matching. Now I'll introduce 3 of our main findings in the project. And yes, this figure is a lot, but I will guide you through, I promise. So first, in the 3 panels of this figure, you can see the different levels of aggregation. So we have individual reply pairs, we have discussions, and we have over days. Then in the rows, we have the predictors, the counter-speech variables. At the top, we have argumentation strategy with opinion, sarcasm, and constructive comments as classes. Then in the middle, we have group rhetoric with exclusive comments about outgroups and inclusive comments about the in-group or both groups. And at the very bottom, we have emotions from anger to clusters like pride and joy. Right. So for the meso and macro level, we used ARDL, and here the pink bars indicate one-leg effects, the purple bars indicate two-leg effects, and the red bars indicate long-run effects. And for simplicity, please, in the following, focus with me on just the long-run effects, and I will also highlight the significant effects with asterisks. The first finding is simple opinions devoid of insults lead to less hateful conversations. And we find this over all three levels of aggregation. And this raises actually an interesting question. Should we encourage people to use strategies that are already in their repertoire, like opinions? Or should we teach them potentially more effective other strategies that they don't know already? Our second finding is any group rhetoric, both in and exclusive, increases hate speech. And exclusive comments about the outgroup are actually the most prevalent in our data set, and they express as trying to weaken the outgroup. But also inclusive comments decrease the quality of the conversation by increasing hate. And we hypothesize that this is mainly because this is used to rally the own group against the others. And then finally, almost all emotional speech makes conversations more hateful. And I'll focus on the results of anger and fear for now. Anger, again, is the most prevalent emotion by far in our data set. And here we see actually mixed effects. So on the level of individual reply pairs, reacting with anger increases hate in the following tweet. But over days, reacting with anger decreases hate. We think that this is probably because the righteous anger of some participants or counter speakers might shift the discussion into a more civil direction over days. For fear, our second most prevalent emotion, we see more consistent effects. Again, over all three levels, individual reply pairs, discussions, and days, we see an increase in hate in the following. So this is a great study because we provide the first large-scale observational study of counter-speech in the wild. We use sophisticated mixed methods to measure hate and counter-speech, and we use matching and ARDL to provide quasi-causal effects. But of course, no study is without limitations. The sample is specific to Germany and Twitter. Other social media platforms could have different dynamics. Social media platforms can also change over time. Our study is observational and can thus be subject to unknown confounders. And the observed effects are not always consistent across the different levels of outcomes. And because it's observational, we have no means of identifying the underlying mechanisms behind what we observe. So to summarize, I showed how I developed and used computational methods for the social sciences in 4 ways. In the emotion regulation project, I proposed a computational method to reveal psychological constructs from text data, and I used this method to infer a data-driven taxonomy of emotion regulation, also uncovering unknown strategies to date. In the hate and counter-speech project, we use qualitative analysis, iterative labeling, and training on confidence samples to boost the performance of our classifiers. And analyzing the relationship between counter and hate, we found that simple opinions devoid of insults are actually a simple but potentially very effective strategy. Now, before I close, let me very briefly tap into what other projects I did during my PhD. To give you the full picture. First, we used the construct mining pipeline and applied it to other constructs. for example, love languages or affection expression. This was a master thesis that was done in cooperation with the University of Constance. Then we compared humans' reappraisal ability to large language models. And we asked GPT-4 as well as humans to rethink negative emotional scenarios. And we saw that GPT actually outperforms 85% of humans on the effectiveness, empathy, and novelty of its reappraisals. We then used natural language processing to try to get at the underlying mechanisms of what we observe. And we will submit this paper soon to Psychological Science. Then we populated a replication database of psychological effects. This was a large community effort that was led by people in Bamberg and Münster. And I contributed investigating one effect in particular, which was the backfire effect. This whole replication database is published in the Journal of Open Psychology Data. And finally, we created a tool measuring students' open science preferences. This is a questionnaire that uses alternative item formats other than Likert scales to reduce social desirability. And we want to use that specifically on a sample of bachelor and master students because they are underrepresented in research on open science practices. This is the stage 1 registered report, and we are currently revising it. That's all I have for today. Thank you very much for listening, and I'm happy to discuss any questions that you have for me now.